Good afternoon, delegates. Welcome to the 28th Annual European Network of Advisory Councils on Environment and Sustainable Development Conference. This is the EEAC network. And it's hosted this year in Dublin by the National Economic and Social Council, NESC. I'm Dr. Cara Augustenborg, your moderator for the next 3 days, and an environmental scientist, campaigner, and broadcaster. And the just transition topic is one that I'm particularly interested in particular because it's so timely given the need for heightened ambition and the challenges we face with respect to the climate and biodiversity emergencies, both in the context of the pandemic and beyond that. You can see there is a chat function in your screen, and we'd encourage you to post any comments or questions, which we'll try to get to as many as possible throughout the event. If you'd like to have the conversation on social media, the hashtags are EEAC28 or Just Transition, or you can tag @NESC Ireland or @EEAC_network to continue the conversation online. And we also have an expo space, which we'd love for you to check out over the next 3 days. Before we begin, NESC would like to acknowledge all of the contributions of organizations and people for this event who so generously allowed us to use their creativity and imagination and their skills through words, music, song, poetry, all sorts of imagery to shine a light on environmental issues, climate change, and of course, the just transition. We are gathering over the next 3 days as part of the EEAC Network's annual conference, and this is a network that brings together 17 advisory bodies who are established through their national or regional governments or parliaments to provide independent advice on environment, climate change, and sustainable development. We've got an exciting few days ahead with many, many sessions for you, so be sure to check the program. And all of this is being recorded by Verve, who have done an incredible job organizing this event, which I really hope you'll appreciate. In addition, we have an expert in the just transition as our rapporteur, Sinead Mercier, who will be recording all of the events and providing a report to us. So hi, Sinead, and many thanks for your contribution to this event. We are particularly honoured that Minister Eamon Ryan will be speaking to us shortly, and on Thursday we're also looking forward to a keynote address from the President of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins. We're gathering right now from countries across Europe, but also throughout the world, to talk about the principles, policies, and practices of what makes a just transition. And this afternoon, in addition to the contribution by Minister Ryan, we also have contributions by the Director of NESC, Dr. Larry O'Connell, Stefano Grossi from the European Commission, and Sharon Burrow from the International Trade Union Confederation. So to get us started, I'm delighted to welcome the Director of NESC, Dr. Larry O'Connell, who will set the scene for us and talk about some of the work that NESC has been doing on just transition.
Thanks so much, Cara. You're all very welcome virtually to Dublin for the annual conference of the EEAC. I particularly want to welcome the chair of the EEAC, Arnaud Carral-Bassat, and all members of the board. I suppose it's for us, we take a deep breath. It's just been such a journey here. We took a decision to bring this conference online, and we were hugely supported in doing so. Initially, we were somewhat disappointed at not being able to welcome people to Dublin Castle, but I hope you'll agree that we have put together a really exciting lineup of speakers. So hopefully the experience virtually will be almost as good as if you were here personally. There will be some time at the end of the conference to thank all of the people who've been involved, but I do want to take a moment just to mention the Secretariat in NESC and in the EEAC. I think their energy and the commitment they've shown in this project has been absolutely tremendous. I'd also like to thank our Chair of NESC, Mr. Martin Fraser, and the Vice Chair, Elizabeth Canavan. They've both been hugely supportive during very busy times for our work on sustainable development. And as I say, I'd really like to acknowledge that support. And finally, before I begin, I would like to also thank Minister Eamon Ryan. Eamon is one of the leaders of the government parties in Ireland at the moment, a person who's extremely busy. And I think, again, he's been very supportive of our work in this area of sustainable development, as has his Department of Environment, Climate and Communications. So in the next few minutes, I'd really like to outline for you some of the work that we've been doing on just transition, in a way to help set the stage for the speakers that are to come. I suppose all of us are living in the throes of a really significant transition at the moment. We're 7 or 8 months into this, and I think we're all more than ready to bounce back. But I think we all feel the need to bounce back better or to build back better. And we have a very interesting video from our National Youth Council, which we'll show you just after 3 o'clock, which I think highlights this need that we all feel to bounce back better. So prior to COVID-19, the challenge that we had been looking at in NESC, and this has been hugely amplified by the whole crisis and the response to COVID-19, is how do we as a society prepare for the kind of transition, the significant transformation that we need to achieve to become a low carbon economy and society. So I would like to offer you 6 brief reflections on what we've learned in our work in this area. The first, I think, is that a vision is absolutely critical. In NESC, we have begun to have discussions around vision, and as the pandemic continues to evolve, it's really clear to us that there's a growing appetite to deepen and to extend this discussion about what type of future we're working towards. Our working vision in NESC is that Ireland would become a resilient, sustainable, thriving net zero economy, society and environment, that we would use innovation and collective preparedness to shape the future that we all want to achieve. The Council has just recently argued that the crisis has vividly and very starkly highlighted the deep connections between economy, society, public health and environment that is so central to this vision. The second reflection that I'd like to offer you is that this vision is absolutely needed, but it is more the light at the end of a tunnel, something that we feel we need to strive towards, rather than something that actually illuminates the path that we currently are on and find the way forward. For enlightenment about what we're actually going to do, to figure out the next steps, we think that we need something else. In that context, plans, templates, expert outside guidance, all have a role. But the reality is there is no all-seeing source of wisdom or an off-the-shelf solution. The world has never decarbonised its activity at the levels that are required. So therefore, we have to enter uncharted waters. Plans, if they are going to be helpful, and we're seeing this on COVID-19, they have to have shorter timeframes. They have to be open to continuous and transparent revision, and we need to have a formal mechanism of doing this. This was a key finding in our work on just transition. There is no blueprint. We can look to other jurisdictions, we can learn what worked well, we can learn what didn't work so well, and we'll hear more about these experiences in other countries over the next couple of days. And these cases were really useful to us. But context is critical. The steps that are needed to transition from peat in the Midlands of Ireland are not the same steps that would be needed to transition from coal in Germany, for example. So my third reflection then is that while we're saying local context is really critical, and we're saying that the importance of local solutions cannot be overlooked, we are not arguing for a hands-off, bottom-up approach. If you take the scale and the urgency of the problem of climate change and biodiversity loss, it cannot be left to what people would like to do. There has to be a pressure for change. So in our work on transition and in our earlier work on climate mitigation strategies, we argued that really effective concrete action and tangible progress depends on processes and structures and institutions that review and examine practices, innovations, successes and failures. And this process of monitoring and review is what we use to drive continuous improvement in local areas, in specific sectors and in national policy. So it's the review, combined with some powers to challenge or to penalise people who are unwilling to adopt better or best practices, that's the pressure for change. It's rigorous, ongoing and careful consideration of practices and continuous review and revision that illuminates the path forward and helps us to strive to achieve the vision. So my fourth reflection then is that the concept of just transition has proved extremely useful to us in NESC. Our work is drawing heavily on and benefiting from the concept of just transition. It has helped our work to focus on 3 areas. Firstly, people. We focus very closely on decent, good jobs, pay and conditions, training, and the role of detailed, fine-grained skills audits for employees and appropriate social protection for those at risk. We focused on place, the importance of place-based regeneration of local communities and infrastructure, including supporting viable but vulnerable enterprises with targeted high-impact funding. And finally, our work with Just Transition has highlighted for us the importance of processes. We have seen the critical importance of institutions and participative processes which connect regional, local and national concerns and considers how we share out the costs and benefits, helps us to address ways of making progress and crucially helps us to eliminate bottlenecks nationally. So our work focused on the question of how government could address employment vulnerability. We look closely at the transition underway in the Midlands, where there is a high concentration of peat production. You'll hear a lot more about this in the 2 spotlight sessions tomorrow, and you'll also hear about and from the Just Transition Commissioner, who was established by government to focus, in the first instance at least, on the transition from peat in that particular region. So my 5th reflection is that the work we carried out found that really something more systematic is also required if we are to identify, examine and respond to the opportunities associated with just transition. The work that we did outlined the potential for a just transition review group that would embody a commitment to a very participative process of in-depth exploration with stakeholders and those who are experiencing the transition at first hand, particularly in relation to climate. Since our work was completed, there have been a number of important developments in Ireland which will influence the final institutional shape of how to manage and oversee a just transition. These include a new Climate Action and Low Carbon Development Bill, which is currently being finalised, government commitments to create a statutory office of a Just Transition Commission, and a commitment to develop a Just Transition Plan. As such, this conference is really very timely. It's an input to the Irish policy process, and we will consider very carefully the strands of discussion and the international experience, and we'll continue to feed this into the decision-making processes and to the Minister with responsibility for environment, climate and communication, Eamon Ryan, who we'll hear from in a few moments. So my final reflection, if I could, to leave you with, is that it would seem to me that COVID-19 is moving or drawing just transition into the mainstream of economic and social policy discourse in Ireland and across Europe. There is a need then to find ways to translate the principles of equality, equity and social inclusion that underlie just transition and the hugely admirable, though very challenging idea of leaving nobody behind, and to translate those into concrete actions and processes. This is now critical. So for this reason, I really want to thank the EEAC for asking us to host this year's annual conference. It has, for us, turned out to be a really timely and insightful request. The lineup of speakers from around the world, combined with the experience of an interest of all of our participants who have joined us today and over the next 3 days, I think provides a real opportunity to move forward how we understand and how we work with just transition to respond to the challenges of our times. Thank you, Cara.
Thank you, Larry, for giving us some insight into what NESC has been doing around just transition. I'm told that Minister Ryan is cycling here as we speak, and so we are going to move to our next 2 experts to come in, and we'll leave Minister Ryan's address until the end of this session. So our next contribution is by Stefano Grossi. Stefano is the head of cabinet to Kadri Simpson, a member of the European Commission responsible for energy. Welcome, Stefano.
Thank you, and good afternoon to all of you in Dublin and in Ireland. I hope you can hear me.
Yeah.
Thank you, and good afternoon also to Director O'Connell and Madam Burrow and to all of you. I'm very glad to join you today for this annual EEAC conference and to stand in on behalf of Commissioner Kadri Simpson, who has a clash with another institutional meeting, but I'm happy to bring her best wishes of success for this important and timely meeting on a very well chosen topic, and to give you the Commission perspective, and I would like to focus on maybe 3 points. First, why we need a Green Deal transition in the first place. What part is, in our view, the justice and fairness of this transition is in the process, and then something on what we can expect for the future. I trust that if you are all attending this event and if you are participating over 3 days, it's because all of us know and are convinced that a transition is unavoidable, and that the task ahead for all of us is not to be overwhelmed or to be passive spectator of this transition and this change, but is to be prepared to manage it and to make it work for everybody in a fair and a just way. And this Commission and President von der Leyen made climate change a top priority for Europe since the start. We set the objective of making Europe a climate neutral continent by 2050 because this is the only credible way to achieve the Paris Agreement goal of limiting the rise in the global temperature to 2 Celsius degrees. And we need to do this to avoid irreversible damage to our planet and also to ourselves. We see the signs of what will happen if we leave climate change unchecked everywhere around us, from the frequency of natural disasters to the number of forest fires over the summer, the drought in a number of areas of our planet that are making those parts almost unhabitable, the loss of biodiversity, and the risk for human health. So to become climate neutral, we need to cut emissions not in years or in 20 and 30 years, but we need to start now. And what we proposed is to cut emissions faster than we were originally envisaged and to reduce them by minus 55% by 2030. And all of that means an overhaul of our energy system. It means that we will need to consume much less energy in the coming years. We will have much more electricity in our system and much more renewables in the generation of electricity in our system. We expect renewables to power at least 2/3 of electricity by 2030. We need a different ways of transport and mobility. We consider that at least 1/5 of the fleets will have to be powered by renewables. Our heating and cooling system will have to change. Our cities, our buildings will need to change. It is a project of widespread and wide-ranging systematic and systemic change for our economy, for our society, which will leave no sector unaffected. But what is interesting is that this change which we are facing is in parallel intertwined with another ongoing transformation, and is a process of ongoing industrial transformation that we see in action in many sectors of our economy, from steel, from cement, from chemicals, aviation, and the manufacturing, where the pressure of global competitiveness is making most of these sectors struggling and is forcing a dislocation and a disruptive change in many of them. And without significant changes in the cost structure, in the industrial processes, and in the business practices of most of these industries, I think by 2050, very little of them will remain in Europe. And if we look at the changes that are necessary, if we want to preserve a European leadership and global competitiveness in this sector, we see that most of these changes are in reality the same changes in terms of digitalization, in terms of uptake of clean energy technologies, in the changing of industrial processes that are needed to face the green transition. And the third reason why we need to take this transition very seriously is because this is not a policy-driven dream. It's not a moral imperative or just a moral imperative. The way we see it is something that is ongoing on a daily basis, driven by the market forces, by the technological change, and by the dynamics of price. And we see it we see it everywhere. We see it in the wind energy having become over the last 10 years the cheapest source of electricity production globally. We see it with the unresistible march of solar power in decentralized and central generation. And all of that is changing irreversibly the way we produce, we consume, and we transport energy. And all these three changes together are modifying the world around us. And hence, I think we need to be prepared. We need to be aware of this change coming up, and we need to be able to run with it and to pilot it. So when we say that the Green Deal is a growth strategy for Europe, this is what we say. We say that facing the green transition is an alternative to economic decline, is an alternative to technological backwardness of Europe, and is an opportunity not only for greener, healthier, and better lives, but is an opportunity for a better growth and a sustainable growth. And all these trends have only been accelerated, as Director O'Connell was saying, by the COVID crisis, which coincided also on a global supply shock on the energy world in terms of oil prices and oil supplies, which reached at one point last spring also a negative territory. And a number of changes that we have seen fostered by the COVID crisis and the adaptation of the crisis are also accelerating the momentum. And we see industrial repositioning, we see divesting from a number of areas in traditional energy sectors towards renewables. We see a strong trend, for instance, in mobility change and uptake of electric vehicles everywhere in Europe. And that's the reason why we have forcefully put the green transition and the digital transition at the heart of a recovery plan, where we presented in spring and was adopted by European Council in July. And we had asked that 37% of the 1.8 million that are coming from the plan will be dedicated to climate neutral expenditure. But the second point is what is to do all of that, this change with this around us, with fairness. And there I think we have to be frank that whenever the European Union has embarked in the past in some big overarching projects like the Green Deal is, we have done good things and bad things. And when we embarked on the single market project, I think at the time we took into account the fact that the project of that would have affected differently the different regions of Europe. Not everyone would have gained in the same way, and some would have had a harder life adjusting to a single market and economic integration. And we created the regional funds. When we launched ourselves in the Euro project and integration of the currency, we left to the member states and to each of them to deal with the distributional and the territorial impact of our policies. And that I think we have seen, and you also in Ireland have seen the consequences and the difficulty when we are facing a hardship and economic crisis. So this time I think it was very clear that it's not possible to promote a transition of the scale and the pace we want in terms of transition to net zero without a very close and strong attention to territories and the different starting points in Europe. Not only will not be just, it will simply not work. So everyone in this transition has a stake, but everyone has a different way to be part of it, and we need to cater for that. And the worst we could do will simply left this transition or facing this transition in a way, improvised way, and a not prepared way. So we made deliberately the aspects of just transition and fair transition not as a secondary add-on to our project of a Green Deal, but it's the element of solidarity is for us a central element of the entire project. What does it mean in concrete? It means three things for us. It means to give adequate instruments for our member states and our regions to address the transition challenges, and that's why we set up a Just Transition Fund, and a mechanism able to mobilize up to 100 billion euro of investment, with a 20 billion euro for for the fund itself to be used to support the regions, and the focus on carbon intensive, coal intensive, but also peat and lignite intensive regions. And we complemented that with other instruments. I will not give you a long list, but from the Modernization Fund to the Innovation Fund to the Cohesion Policy, I think with time we have a wide array of instruments that can be used for a fair transition. The second element is that this has to do in a spirit of partnership. This is not a Europe that can stand somewhere in Brussels and let the others sort out their problems once we set a regulation or a policy. We need to stand by our regions, by our communities, engaged in a transition. And that's why we have set up a system of country teams. We call them just transition teams of technical assistance. And I'm very proud that we sent already, I think, last summer of 2019, a team to the Midlands to understand the problems, to listen to the problems, and provide some technical advice and accompany in a process the region. And I could not subscribe more to what Director O'Connell indicated in terms of a philosophy, the process, and the method by which Ireland is addressing the transition in the Midland region. And method is the third element that we see as critical, because, as I said, any transition can be faced unless we face it unprepared or unmanaged. This is the worst we can do. So we insist a lot that for every territory, every region, every situation, we need to have a clearly designed strategy. We need to look at possible alternatives and a wide array of policies and instruments that you can mobilize, because there are a lot of things that you can do to help a territory find an alternative pathway to growth once you come out of coal or peat or reliance on one of these sources, whether it is reskilling, whether it is support to small and medium companies, creating new sources of energy, energy efficiency of buildings, renovating schools. There is a lot of things that can be done to give a new life to a territory that maybe for 100 years and more has lived on a certain business model.
Stefano, I'm going to have to cut you off there because we're short for time, but can we address some of these extra issues in the Q&A?
Can I just make one quick point?
Sure, of course.
Very attached, because I think it's important that we address the transition. It's important that we focus on the justness, but I think it's more important that we have clear that we are facing an unprecedented opportunity for growth. Because if you look at what Ireland and many other regions can gain from developing offshore wind, from developing biomethane in the agricultural sector, in the ocean energy, I think this is unprecedented. There are incredible gains to be done in terms of jobs to be created, opportunities for engineers, for scientists, for workers, for offshore workers, for fishermen in the coastal regions. It's an incredible opportunity. I can give you all the figures, but I think what we have, and I close here, why we insist that we need to be audacious in this transition, however difficult can look to the people in the Midlands or elsewhere, is because we have the skills, we have the technology, we have the courage to deal with this challenge, and we can turn adversity into opportunity. And I think as many times, and I close here, as Ireland and Europe done it, we can face to a challenge, rise to it, and successfully cope with it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Stefano, for ending on a hopeful note. And there's a lot of issues there that you covered, which I'm sure we'll address in the Q&A. I'm delighted and relieved that our Minister Ryan has arrived here by fossil-free transport. Eamon Ryan is the Minister for Environment, Climate, Communications and Transport here in Ireland, an enormous brief. Also leader of the Green Party and a passionate advocate for climate change and just transition for several decades. So it's really an honour to have you in studio, Eamon.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Cara. And I'm just keen to respond to a few things Stefano was saying there, but just backing up what he's saying. But
First, I think he's right. The European Union, the way the Union is working now is that it does leave it to national governments to draft their new National Energy and Climate Action Plan, so to be country-specific to meet an overall target, but that flexibility is there. And secondly, he's correct. There's huge opportunities for us in the likes of ocean energy and creating employment. And we're already starting that in a just transition way. I would argue, I had a recent meeting with Bord na Móna on the potential actually to protect jobs and create new jobs in that switch to renewable energy. But what I want to do, just in my short contribution, maybe just to broaden out the concept of just transition as I see it, in terms of how this transformation to a zero carbon future in 3 decades will provide a very much even a wider transition that transforms our entire economy and the social economy, often not in the paid economy. And 3 examples of that just to share, and maybe comes from my own experience, our own area of interest. I started off life as a transport campaigner, public life, and I always felt I was promoting cycling, Dublin Cycling Campaign, and still am now as Minister of Transport. But I always felt that switch to sustainable transport modes, to public transport and active travel, it wasn't just an environmental issue, it was actually fundamentally a social issue. I always remember realising in Dublin City, where I represented as a councillor, half the households didn't own a car, and they were left out in a system that was all a massive investment towards private transport. And in that switch, it'll be a just transition. And even around I suppose, when we're promoting active travel and walking and cycling in the public realm, I think that's part of a just transition, because how you engage with each other on a street, how you create public spaces that belong to everyone, that are not noisy, full of air pollution, threatening if you let go of the hand of a child, that's part of a just transition. And it lowers emissions, but it also creates a different sense of society, in my mind. And secondly, to take an example, and again, we will create jobs in retrofitting, we will save emissions, we will rely on our own and make our own renewable fuels work. But also, the fundamental mission, if we're going in the next 2 decades to actually upgrade 1.5 million Irish homes, it's the end to fuel poverty in that project, as an outcome of that project, is probably the biggest just transition project in terms of and it's not just fuel poverty and saving money on energy bills, but saving on the health bills and living in a home in this cold northerly climate that we're in, where you don't feel cold, is a fundamental change in the quality of people's lives, is a fundamental benefit in a just transition way, in my mind, as well as the jobs. And we always look at the kind of technical, the energy side of it. It's that human side of it, which I think is one of the biggest change. And thirdly, if you look at a map of Ireland for poverty, if you look at where do we fall behind more than anywhere else, it tends to be in those regions in the west, northwest, southwest, where maybe there's more marginal land. Farming is not as profitable. You know, it's not the dairy farmer earning 100 grand a year, it's the suckler farmer earning 13 grand a year. And the whole wider society falls behind because of that. The transition we're going to have to do to pay those same people, suckler farmers, to start storing carbon, to start improving biodiversity, to managing flood risk and improving water quality, to reduce nitrogen and ammonia pollution as well as greenhouse gas emission pollutions. That is a fundamental reshaping of the country. And that's core to the just transition. If you can give the promise of a 20-something-year-old in a less affluent rural area, the certainty that in the next 30 or 40 years, their work is going to be highly prized, well paid, secure, have real status. That's a just transition project, in my mind, of real scale. So yes, we need to do it renewable energy. Yes, we need to do it protecting workers' rights and making sure that those industries that fall behind are given a new lease of life or a new purpose. But it's the bigger, wider social transition, the newer, wider kind of sense of economy that comes looking after your home, the economics, looking after your home, that very basic improvement in people's homes, improvement in their local public realm, improvement in wealth in those parts of the country that historically have been most left behind. They're the key just transition projects in my mind. They will take 2 or 3 decades to deliver, But a razor-sharp focus on them and getting public support for them will be the best way of delivering a just transition, best way of delivering a very different economy, in my mind.
Thank you so much, Eamon, for that. I have to say, you're the first minister I've seen at a conference who doesn't read a speech. It's very refreshing to have such a frank and honest address there. And you've given us a lot of ideas for potential jobs and opportunities through the just transition. I'd like to go now to our final speaker, Sharon Barrows. But before I do that, I know, Eamon, that you have to rush off, and that I just wanted to say on behalf of NESC and the EEAC that we want to thank you for your contribution today.
I'm going to stay to listen to Sharon because I've heard her speak in the past, and she speaks with real eloquence and inspiration. So, but I can't stay for the Q&A because the mad laugh.
I was actually going to say that the last time I saw Sharon was 5 years ago at the climate gathering that you organised. So I'm interested to see how her thinking has
I'm going to see what Sharon has to say. We'll throw it over to her.
Excellent. So our last contribution for this afternoon is Sharon Burrow, who is the General Secretary of the International Trade Union Confederation, which represents 200 million workers in 163 countries and territories. So Sharon, you've been a pioneer on this issue for a long time. We're really looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Well, I must say, Minister, congratulations, and the best of luck and support from all of us for your mission, because just transition is simply non-negotiable. I would tell you that this is not just critical for climate and for a just recovery from the current crisis, but it's also about rebuilding trust in democracy. If you actually think less than 50% of our people now live in democracies, and if you understand that just over 40% of young people, only 40% of young people trust in democracies compared to 2/3 to 70% in the 80s and 90s. We have to rebuild trust in democracy. And when you think about why that trust has broken down, it's because we've seen massive change in our labour force, in our global economy since the 80s and the advent of hyper-globalisation, when the social contract started to break down, and none of it's been about people. It's not been about our communities. It's actually trusted that somehow this extreme wealth would trickle down. Well, those neo-liberal economic days have to be over. So I would say to you that just transition is non-negotiable to reach the climate goals of net zero, but also to make sure people have hope and therefore trust. And I think that looking at the developments around the climate bill and so on, which I'll make a couple of comments about, Ireland is treading in the right direction. So thank you, Minister. But I wanted to remind people that we have a convergence of crisis even before we got to COVID-19. We had that inequality, historic levels of inequality. We had the climate emergency and the risk of the extinction of people themselves. And indeed, that was underpinned by a breakdown in the global labour market that's just extraordinary. If you think governments have failed to regulate for decent work, when you have 60% of the world's people in informal work, no rights, no rule of law, no social protection, no minimum wage, this is extraordinary. And 40% in the formal sector, a third of they are in precarious employment, including 0 hours contracts. What a nonsense. And indeed short-term contracts, again, often without social protection. And without collective bargaining rights or minimum wages or income in that whole new world of internet-mediated business or platform business that's growing. I refuse to call it the gig economy because there's not much that's fun about it, I can assure you. And it goes way beyond the Ubers and the Deliveroo's as much as we want to and are organising them. It is eating into all of our professions. But right now, I also want to say that if that was the crisis before, then the impact of COVID-19 made those fractures now look like craters. They're just blowing open the fact that this world is not working for people and we need a new economic model. So the role of just transition in guiding a new social contract, because if the social contract broke down in the 80s, then we need to see that, in fact, we rebuild it and we rebuild it rapidly, and it must be on just transition. And I would say, to meet the test of climate, the test of full employment, let's actually revisit an old but true ambition for our people, full employment. And if we're going to meet both those tests, if we're going to climate and employment proof our future, then these are the things we need. We need investment in jobs, climate-friendly jobs. We can have massive amounts of jobs in care, in sustainable or enabling green infrastructure, in cities, in repair of ecosystems, in agriculture, mass transit, industry policy for manufacturing as we deal with technology, with just transition, and reposition our industries and supply chains. All of this is possible, but it takes a lens on investment that's very different. We need a labour protection floor for all workers. This was agreed last year at the ILO Centenary Declaration negotiations. It's unconscionable that we have people in the informal economy, people in our own society, of labour market protection. We can give them fundamental rights as a protection. We can give them occupational health and safety, and we want to see that, particularly in the light of the exposure of health and safety, and it's important with COVID-19, indeed as a fundamental right. We need an adequate or evidence-based minimum wage, a minimum wage on which you can live with dignity, or a living wage. And we actually want to see maximum hours of work. That's been agreed. That should be the labour protection floor for all jobs, and we have to make that happen. But then we have to have universal social protection. We won't ever have resilience if people can't trust that they will not be thrown on the scrap heap. Stranded assets, no, we don't want them, but stranded people, stranded workers, even more so. So we definitely need to make sure that social protection for everybody is fundamental. And we need inclusion and equality for women, unfinished business, progress for women on every indicator stalled, yet you want to battle the solutions. And I heard Stefano, and I agree, you know, the solutions in large part can be local. They need the global and the national investment and the support, but solutions can come from tripartitism, from local engagement, from that place-based approach to solutions. And yet we won't do that without women. And so it's time, beyond time. I just want to say that we need a different approach to financing the recovery. And I'm glad, Minister, that you're here, because we need tax, not austerity. There's some unfinished business in the distribution of wealth, and we can make this work. An end to corporate immunity is high on our agenda. It's not impossible for governments everywhere to mandate due diligence, even as we're negotiating the UN Treaty on Business and Human Rights. We need a new approach, and there are many, many employers out there who want to work with unions, with government, to actually assess the risk in supply chains, to put the grievance in place to effect remedy, to build trust and to monitor those supply chains. It's not just about modern slavery. It is about all those conditions of workers who've lost. As passionate as I am about eliminating slavery, we must look after every worker, and then we will have achieved that end as well. And of course, the big tech companies, like digitalisation is part of this agenda. Stefano's right. But if we don't break up those big tech companies, if we don't end surveillance at work and protect privacy online, then we're simply creating another law of the jungle where global monopoly is put ahead of people, and that's not acceptable. I wanted to congratulate you on the climate bill. I know that there's a lot of tension around transition, particularly in sectors like the peaked areas, but we can, if we have just transition, if the design of the transition is, you know, absolutely fought out at the table with employers, people, unions, government, and communities, the people that are affected, then we can put in a plan for replacing those jobs. So I would say to you, we need a net zero economy. I'm uncompromising about that because it's about the survival of the human race. But we need a net zero job dividend. For every job lost, let's create another one. It's just a matter of political will. And we need, indeed, a different approach to debt. I don't have time to go into that, but if we invest patiently in the future, we take a medium to long-term approach, and the European Union's opened this door, and we take a medium to long-term approach on managing debt and some solidarity across the debt relief and the fiscal space developing countries need with a global social protection fund, we can actually see to it that we shift to a different development model. I would just say don't forget the role of cities and regions. We need to look at how we invest in cities. If we're going to have 7 to 9 billion people on the planet in our cities within decades, then we need to make sure they're livable and there are jobs and jobs there. And they're the catalyst for supply and demand in and out of our regional or indeed our global rural communities. But unless we have social dialogue at all levels, unless we accept that every industry has to transition, we will fail the test that's given to us right now. So rebuilding a just future, just transition sits at the core. And can I tell you from my perspective, this is a battle of the generations. So let's make sure this is indeed about people who sit at the heart of that future we want to actually describe and to build. And I really appreciate the Irish colleagues, sisters and brothers who are prepared to fight for this, because we're going to need every one of you, both nationally and globally. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon, and we really appreciate all your work on this too. I'm going to start by asking you a question. We've had lots of questions come in, and I'll go back to Stefano too. But you know, you're great at the big picture and the visionary thinking on just transition. But can I get you to nail down maybe what the next step is tomorrow or next month to ensure that no one is left behind in this transition to a net zero society?
Sure. Well, if you have to transition every sector, then you have to start with where employers and working people are. So if you look at, for example, heavy industry, the steel industry, people think about manufacturing as, dirty business. Yes, it is. But we have to make sure that, in fact, we can, and we know we can, particularly now with the development of green hydrogen, and I stress green hydrogen, we can build heavy industry, we can transition heavy industry, but you won't do it without the employers and the workers involved, because that's the transition. So support for the shifting technologies, the skills, and of course it's underpinned by energy. And Stefano is right. You know, if you've got a target of wind, I think driving we haven't seen the detail of the strategy yet, but up to 65% of electricity, then that's a big transition. There are jobs in that. There are jobs for our young people who want to work in the energy industry. And you translate that back into Ireland and say, well, where's the heavy industry? You don't have so much, I know, but you have a lot of agriculture. Where's the energy transition and the capacity to build, smart and inclusive and safe food processors for the future, or whether it's services, or whether it's, the soft infrastructure of health, education, care. We need to make sure all these sectors count. So I can tell you story after story of people building the transition plans around the world. I'm not going to labour the worst of it, because it's painful to walk the coalfields or sit down with fossil fuel, workers, but they know, even as they're angry because they haven't had the just transition support they should have, they know we have to make this transition, but they want to see some simple measures. Just transition is all about a few simple things. It's about making sure that where workers are displaced, if they're older workers, they have secure pensions. If there's only a few years left and they opt to retire, they have a bridge to those secure pensions. If they're younger workers, they have income and skills support and redeployment support. And if they're in their communities, they want to know their communities are going to see reinvestment and renewal for themselves, but also for their children. people care about their communities. We don't want to see people anymore forced to leave the homes and the history and the heritage that they and their parents and grandparents have built over many decades. So it's local, it's national, and of course we have to have a very different multilateral approach. But I can tell you, if you don't involve people at the local and the employment base with the unions in the industry, this will fail and people won't trust it.
Thank you. Yeah, you've had a lot of agreement from the audience on those comments there. Stefano, I want to come back to you, and I have a very specific question, which is quite topical and relevant this week. I hope you feel comfortable answering it. But can you give us some explanation on why there is so little alignment between the Green New Deal and the Common Agricultural Policy in Ireland, or in Europe? As you know, Ireland has a very special interest in agriculture, and so this is an issue that's coming up a lot for us this week.
I wouldn't say, I'm not a specialist of agriculture, to be honest, but I wouldn't be so radical. I wouldn't say that there is so little alignment, because what I see also, what is being discussed in Council and Parliament, I think that there is still quite an openness to a greater integration of green consideration into farming practices and into sustainable agriculture. I think the agriculture is objectively one of the sectors when it is harder and is more difficult to bring a shift. But I think looking at it from our perspective, it's also an area where there are huge opportunities that can go in to the benefit of the farmers themselves in the clean energy transition. And when we use cryptic words like energy system integration, this means that there are a lot of technologies out there now that, if integrated into farming practices, they can help really reduce not only methane emissions, but they help use waste, help use the biomasses for production, of instance, of biogas or biomethane. It can be used for heating, can be used for generation of electricity in districts, and it's hugely cost effective and can be an additional source of income for farmers. So I know it's a challenge. I know that changing also when the pressure on returns and income is very steep. I think the minister gave you some indication for some small farmers, how much under pressure they are in their margins, how difficult it is to integrate new technologies. But I think there is an area where, with the help of you and national funds, a lot of technical assistance and an incentive to young farmers who are readier to take greater risks and to explore new techniques, I think a lot has to be done. So I wouldn't be... I think we have to be realistic on what we ask from agriculture, but I think that agriculture is able and will be giving a great contribution to the clean energy transition.
You're speaking from an energy point of view, and I think the frustration here is coming more from the lack of consideration on biodiversity, but I really appreciate that response. Sharon, really good questions come in from the panel here. Do you think that a universal basic income would be the start of a policy toward just transition?
We definitely support universal social protection, which has a universal basic income component. If you're not in work, if you're not earning a living wage, then of course you should have the social protection that makes it possible for you and your family to survive. That's always been part of the trade union movement. Do I personally, and does the movement think that a universal basic income for the richest amongst us, or for those of us that earn a decent salary, compared to the solidarity with those who don't, is justified? No. And I would argue against that everywhere. We have to share resources and distribute resources so that we look after anybody who's a working person without appropriate income support for themselves and their families. And of course, for those who tragically are unemployed or have other forms of, society challenging lives, whether it's disability or periods of ill health or whatever. But it is critically important that everybody can at least have a touchstone of security. We call it social protection. That is a minimum income, and it has to be set at a level on which you can survive.
That. Stefano, I just want to go back to you. We have a question from the audience here, and they refer to John Barry pointing out that the planetary crisis is not a normal policy issue, which I think we would all agree with that. So how do we square the need for urgent and rapid action with the policy process of incrementalism, which I think you would experience at a large scale in the EU?
No, I think whoever asked the question from the audience is right. I think this is not the moment for incremental changes. It's a moment to be bold. And frankly, I will not characterize what we put on the table since December as marginal or timid change. Because asking our economies to adapt to a minus 55% cut in emissions by 2030, when until 2 years ago, we were probably wondering if 40% cut was too much. I think it's a bold move. I think it's doable. We have analyzed the impact it has on our economy, on our society, on our workers, and I think we have the technologies, we have the resources, we have now the recovery plan to do it. But I think we have to be very clear. It's a huge of a challenge. It means when we say overhauling, it means a deep radical change in the way we live, in the way we consume, in the way we produce and transport energy, in the way in our buildings, in our transport patterns. It's in every walk of life. This requires a radical change. It's an investment challenge of 350 billion euro per year for the next 10 years and beyond. So we are, I think we are trying to call on us. We are giving to ourselves a very daunting task and a daunting challenge. But what the message we want to give is not only that this is unavoidable, but this is something that we have and we can do it, because as Europeans, we are technological leaders in many of those sectors. We have a lot to gain in terms of preserving this leadership and turning it into a source of new jobs. It's giving perspectives to a lot of people that otherwise would not have it. So I think I absolutely agree. What we put on the table, I think sometimes we have to make compromises, but what we have put on the table until now, I wouldn't say it's something timid, because this is the moment to take courageous action. And the benefits will be paid off in 20, 30, 40 years, maybe for another generation, not mine. But I think it's the right way to go ahead. And I totally agree. It's not the moment for timid steps.
Thanks. Just a follow-up question to that, because it's quite specific. But do you see the new EEAG, the state aid, taking cognizance of the just transition?
Yes, we are working on that. It's always very delicate to touch and adjust our stated guidelines, because on one hand, you have to balance two interests. There is one interest is to make sure that public funds can stimulate and have a positive effect on economic activities where we consider of public interest, but where I think the market itself is not able to produce the investment we need, or where we need to create a market because it's the new technologies or these activities are still in a deployment or demonstration phase, and we need to support them, that take hydrogen, electrolyzers, etc. But the reality is, and I am a scholar of Mario Monti, we need to remind that state aid is also a great source of asymmetry and divergence in Europe, because there are some member states who have bigger budgets, sounder and healthier public finances, and are able to direct a lot of funds to their own industries, while others, because having to deal with other problems or legacy problems of their public finances, will find themselves in a more difficult situation in supporting their own sector and their own industries in the same area. So we always need to balance the need to foster innovation and technological change, and at the same time to preserve a level playing field across Europe, to avoid that in reality some are pushed off the market. So yes, we are working on that, but I hope we will find a balanced solution.
That's a fair point. Sharon, of course, you're welcome to come in on any of those questions there, but I also have a specific question for you. First, the audience member says that you are right about a deal for peat and other sectors being possible with political will, but where is the space for any real social dialogue on getting the change we need here in Ireland? And I think that's a frustration a lot of us share, is the lack of space for social dialogue. Do you have any advice for us in pursuing that?
Well, I was a little bit surprised and disappointed to see in the climate bill that there's no specific reference to just transition and having the dialogue that makes that possible. And I hope that can be rectified in, indeed, the developments over time, as I said, in every sector of the economy in Ireland and across Europe. But, you know, dialogue has to come from people understanding that there will be no trust if the design doesn't meet the test of workers, community expectations. So the way to build social dialogue is, first of all, for everybody to accept that unless we all agree on the solutions, and yeah, they'll be contestable. This is going to be one of the toughest and most systematic changes or systemic changes we face ever, and we're already behind time. So I can't tell you that you can impose social dialogue except by legislation, but I can tell you if you don't have social dialogue, and I would love to see it reflected in the climate work, then you will not build the trust that's necessary, because people won't understand what the plan is. They won't have the confidence to monitor and evaluate the plan, as Stefano says, if it needs adjustment as you go along. And this needs to be the talk of the town. Everybody needs to understand what we have to do. The future can always be built by people, but not if we exclude them.
I'm glad you mentioned the climate bill. This is something I've been taking a lot of interest in lately. Are you saying that you think that just transition should be incorporated into that bill, for example, through social dialogue, or is there another way that you would envision just transition coming into the climate amendment bill?
Well, just transition cannot happen without social dialogue. So I can't speak for the Irish people. But my advice would be that, and we're asking every government in their nationally defined contributions, the ambition you put to the climate conference next year, that just transition is there. And just transition, if you look at the definitional aspects of it anywhere, has to be based on social dialogue and agreement. And then, of course, the plans that go along with it to affect the investment, the shifts, the reskilling, the support for workers, and whatever community plans we have. So, yes, I would advise anybody to make sure that you spell out that just transition is vital, and also a recognition that all sectors have to transition, because we are still seeing the focus, yes, on the hardest to abate sectors. That's important. But every sector has to make a contribution, and we can make positive contributions with the way we change our construction industry or our transport industry or other sectors. So while it's dependent on energy, it's not the only part of the equation.
Thanks. I'll take one more question before we finish off from an audience member, thanking you both for your inputs and saying, given all of your contributions, they're wondering what some mechanisms for policy making to widen the scope of policy making and understand how policies beyond classic just transition policies, for example, retraining, but could we incorporate these in broader policies such as those that enhance societal well-being, inclusion, and equity as part of that? So maybe Stefano, if you could briefly address that, and then we'll close the Q&A session.
Well, you're stretching my knowledge to the limits, because this is beyond much beyond an energy policy. But I think there is a point in that, and I think we need to integrate the issue of solidarity, I think, in all our policies, and especially when you look at the territorial transition and what can happen in an area like the Midlands or others in other parts of Europe. Indeed, there are so many different policies and different tools that you need to bring along if you want to make a difference. So whether it is social policies, education, research, whether you need to bring in industrial policy, energy policy, you really need to have a plan and chart a pathway for a territory, and you need to bring these elements everywhere. And we are also progressively trying to include this idea of a just transition in whatever we are doing. Whether, I think, if you follow the current events, whether we are looking at also the response to the COVID crisis and the vaccine and the development of vaccines, I think our focus is not only to make sure that every country has a strategy and has the means, once the vaccines will be available, to make them distribute into the most vulnerable people in the population and progressively to everybody, but also that we have enough doses and enough, we will have access to enough of them for all the member states because some of them, for natural reasons, will be less able to negotiate themselves with the big giants in pharmaceutical companies, global giants. So that's an area where also the EU has an impact and can have a value added, where we need to integrate these elements of solidarity. But we could go on and on. I think it is now an element that cuts across all our policies. I think tomorrow, we are also presenting a proposal on minimum wage, which is also a way to contribute to the response to the social effects of a crisis. The COVID-19 is an health emergency, but it will soon turn to be also a social crisis. So I think through everything that we do, the energy poverty in energy, the just transition for some territories, the fight against the vaccines, the minimum wage, all our policies, I think we are integrating this concern for equality, for justness, for fairness, and I think is what people expect from the European Union, and I hope we will be able to deliver.
Well able to speak beyond your energy
that
policy.
One sentence.
Sure.
If you actually look at the pillars of the European recovery, it's what we would want everywhere, the social pillar. So it is about rights and inclusion. The actual Green Deal, which of course is where we all have to go. The biggest ambition for a climate future where you can, you can build jobs on a living planet. You know, we started this debate by saying there are no jobs on a dead planet. Well, now we need to build all those jobs on a living planet. So it has to be entwined. And of course, the Just Transition Fund, that's a fantastic base for the recovery. And Stefano's right. In fact, it's one of your Irish daughters, Esther Lynch, at the ETUC, who's shepherding through with the minimum wage bill. And it's a big passion for me, because if you look at wages since that breakdown began of the social contract in the developed world in the 80s, it's like a roller coaster going that way. But I was shocked to walk amongst particularly your, Central and Eastern European neighbours who are either in the EU or in accession, and find that a third of their children are leaving their countries because they can't live on the minimum wage or the wages they earn. So congratulations, let's get that done. But also the EU is looking at that minimum income piece that you raised earlier and what that looks like and how it should be designed. So right now, Europe has the potential to set a new floor of social and economic policy that has inherently in it those areas of justice and the rule of law. And the recovery package, as much as it's been contestable, we absolutely are on the side of the leadership on this one.
Thanks, Sharon. great questions, great answers from you guys too. And unfortunately, we had so many questions, we didn't even get to a fraction of them, but we will try and do our best to get to more of them later. So I just want to thank Sharon and Stefano in particular for your contributions today and for your time. And of course, Larry and Minister Ryan. This session is now closed, but come back for our second session of the evening shortly. Thanks, Sharon and Stefano.
Thank you.
As we know, a just transition must involve every sector and every group in society, and that's why NESC felt it was so critical to involve young people and artists in this event. So before the next session, we're pleased to be able to share with you a short video presentation by the National Youth Council of Ireland. And this video is called Building Back Fairer, A Just Transition for All. It highlights the key messages contained in their recently launched Climate Justice Manifesto. And here is David Poland to tell you more.
Young people have been at the forefront of climate action, and we want to continue to lead. We had many strong messages coming from young people, but to keep this succinct, our overarching message is one of unity in facing the challenges ahead while keeping our social justice lens on the climate crisis. This needs to be ingrained with a strong commitment of making a just transition a reality as soon as possible. Young people are imagining the future they want, and yes, it is one of green jobs and low emissions, but dig deeper, and we envision a much fairer society with reduced inequalities. An economy with low carbon public transport, home heating, retrofitting, and electric vehicles sound appealing, but needs to be affordable for everybody. Policies must not exacerbate regional inequalities that already exist, since most people in greenhouse gas intensive industries can be found in regions that are already underinvested in. Let me give you my area as an example. I grew up on a farm in rural Galway where I could see Bordnamona Power Station from my back garden. Their bogs are still connected to my bog and farm. After decades together, our community and Bordnamona are inextricably interlinked. When I walk down my farm and look at Bordnamona, I understand it's a carbon-intensive industry. But what I also see is by far the single biggest employer in my community for decades. Bordnamona afforded my friends and the generations before them the opportunity to live and work where they grew up. The continuous apprenticeships and jobs are now gone, and I, like many others, am finding it harder and harder to see a future for myself in my own home place. In the last number of years, we've lost our only post office, credit union, and petrol station. Even the local link bus drives through our empty village without stopping. Our video tried to highlight the plight of communities like mine that are scattered all over Ireland and throughout the EU, but also bring a sense of hope and optimism that something better could be on the horizon. We are at a crossroads, and there is another path we can take. So today, we call on NESC to help save our communities. We plead with you to remember that you are not just changing policies, you are changing the way many people have lived their entire lives. We see the SDGs as having an important role to play, drawing together climate action, reduced inequalities, decent work and economic growth, and affordable clean energy. If we are to make the most of the Green New Deal, it will be necessary to bring everyone with us. Help us be part of a positive, inclusive journey for a just transition. Do not leave us behind. Thank you very much.
A just transition. She seems unsure about her mission, as if whatever is ahead of her seems like such a confliction. Still wondering, yet knowing where she needs to go. You can almost see the thoughts in her blue eyes simply just at a flow. She feels guilty all of a sudden, as if she didn't want to leave anyone behind. Turns around to everyone and asks, why do you all seem so blind? Confused she looks at all of the tampered communities. 'Twas as if they couldn't see just the plethora of open opportunities. As the bright green grass bristles against her toes, yet the hot air and smell of fuel infests at her nose. Sick she feels at where she is at, as if the world she sits in feels off, sick, or even just crap. Follow me, she yelps at an unbothered community, too busy with their lives as if they have this sense of immunity. It will be better, she states, even cleaner, she narrates, as if wherever she goes, a better future awaits. Division she notices and how confused she seems at the minority communities facing adverse extremes. She talks about inclusive communities and fair societies. I promise, she said, as if that would quell our environmental anxieties. Sustainable fisheries and greener deliveries. She will be why we talk about such histories. Just Transition is her name. Follow her now and leave no one to blame. Young people, old people, businesses and sectors. She talks to you to warn you before it festers. Urban, rural, everyone alike. She's calling you now, come and take your mic. She speaks of smiling oceans and clear emotions. It will be because of her we stopped all of these commotions. Smiling she begins, noticing communities listen. She calls on us to act now and end this division. Learn from this we must, and never ignore future science. It will be because of her just transition that extends this world's deadlines. Just Transition is her name. We must carry on forward together with her, with the clear absence of shame.
Wow, thanks to the National Youth Council of Ireland for that really moving piece. It's the first time I've seen it, and I got quite chilled there. We now turn to the second session of this afternoon's programme for some key experts and practitioners who are working on the just transition in different contexts. We're delighted to have Dr. Robert Pollock from the Initiative for Coal Regions in Transition Secretariat, Dr. Fergus Green from Utrecht University, and Charlotte Hartley from the Scottish Just Transition Commission with us today. For this session, we're interested in useful insights from your experiences of just transition practices and institutions that might have wider applicability. Robert, you have direct experience with many of the regions across Europe who are in the process of moving away from coal and peat, like us here in Ireland, as part of the European Commission's platform. Would you briefly introduce your work and make a few opening remarks for us?
Yes, of course. I actually have a presentation, so if the presentation could be brought up, that would be appreciated. Thank you. Thank you. As you've heard, I'm Robert Pollock, and I'm with the Secretariat to the Initiative for Coal Regions in Transition. The initiative was established by the European Commission to assist transition in EU regions that have a high dependence on coal, shale oil, or peat for their energy needs. Next slide, please. In regard to the initiative, I lead the technical assistance that the initiative provides. And our technical assistance programme is known as START, Secretariat Technical Assistance to Regions in Transition. Now, we provide technical support in four broad areas. Firstly, in strategy development, and that relates to the domains of energy transition and economic diversification. And there's a clear, obviously, overlap between energy transition and economic diversification. We also provide support to regions and localities on project identification. What are the projects that will deliver a just transition within their communities? We also provide support in terms of project development, assisting with the design and development of appropriate projects. And finally, the Technical Assistance Programme also provides guidance and support on governance and capacity. I think it's fair to say that our approach is very much based on co-creation of solutions. And co-creation requires close engagement with regional recipients, but also the private sector and civil society within the affected communities. And finally, we require coordination with other transition actors, such as other European Commission Directorate Generals, the World Bank, OECD, etc. If we could have the next slide, please. Currently, the START programme is delivering technical assistance in 7 regions. Now, these are very diverse regions with differing needs, and I think that is my first critical message in regard to engendering a just transition. You have to recognize that every region is different, every locality is different, and so there has to be a degree of tailoring in regard to the policy and practice response. So some of the regions we work in are quite rural in nature, others are quite urban, some have a mono-industrial economic character, others have a more diversified economy, some are dependent on hard coal, some are dependent on lignite, and in the case of the Midlands and Ireland, it's dependent on peat. So those are the 7 regions we're working with. As you can see, they cover a variety of regions and member states. If I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. However, the purpose of my very short introduction was just to offer some initial lessons in regard to engendering a just transition. Now, the START programme, the Technical Assistance Programme, has only been working for 1 year across those 7 regions. But these are some of our early lessons. Firstly, to deliver capable, focused policy and practice, you have to respond to this institutional context in which you're operating. And as I said, all regions and localities are different. And so what you will find is that power and agency is actually dispersed in different ways in different places. So in some countries we're working with, there is a lot of power and agency at the regional level. In other countries, it's at the national level. Again, this is true of the private sector. In some regions we're working with, power is concentrated in a handful of industrial actors. In other regions, it's much more dispersed. In some regions, civil society is very active, in some less active. So you have to comprehend the institutional context in which you're operating and tailor your policy and practice to that environment. I think the second point is one of the things we've recognised is where there is joined up government between the local level, the regional level, the national level, and the EU level, that does greatly enable the process of transition. And I must say that in the case of the Midlands and Ireland, there are very encouraging signs of that level of collaboration between levels of government. The speakers have already referenced the need for a pathway plan, a vision for a region, and that is critical. There has to be a long-term pathway plan of transition. It's very important to always recognise that transition is a marathon, it's not a sprint. And for that journey, you have to articulate what are your actions in the short term, the medium term, and the long term. And by long term, I mean 10 years plus. You have to understand the sequencing of action, because if you do not get your sequencing correct, you may actually preclude future action by the actions you take today. The other point is you need flexibility. The transition environment is fluid, it's rapidly changing, so must your plan be. So you need a short term, a medium term, and a long term leading to that vision. My fourth point is affected localities need to be the focus of support. Often technical assistance is focused at the national level or the regional level, but we have to actually focus our support on the affected communities, and we have to engage those communities. And the communities and the residents in those communities are the agents of change. They are not victims of change. They can be key agents of change, if not the essential agents. My fifth point is that legacy assets of the coal industry or a carbon-intensive industry, such as industrial assets, energy assets, transport assets, but also human capital, the skills of the local people, can also be repurposed. But that requires new investment and fusion with new technologies. And that relationship between the endogenous and the exogenous is a difficult one to choreograph, but it's essential for transition. My penultimate point is that we've lived through a period of austerity in Europe, and we're living through a period of economic crisis and uncertainty with COVID-19. And what we find is that there are many plans for transition, but there is often not the capacity at the local, the region, or the regional level to actually implement those plans or to absorb the technical assistance. And so I think we have to consider, how do we develop capacity at a local and regional level for transition? My final point is that transition requires a systems approach, but it is fair to say that the policy actors still find it difficult to think in a systems manner, and our processes and our methods are still embryonic in regard to systems redesign. But that is critical. If we're going to manage the multi-actor complexity of transition, promote coordination, promote collaboration, and inclusive approaches, we are going to have to think in a systems fashion. Anyway, I'll leave it there. Time is short, so I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Robert. That's an impressive list of lessons for just 1 year of work there. I'm sure we'll have lots of questions from the audience about that later. Fergus, you are an academic researcher who's explored the Australian experience of just transition. Can I invite you to say a few words on your experience?
Yes, certainly. Thank you. I'd like to share 3 lessons from my experience and research on just transition in Australia. Lesson 1 is that institutions matter. There's a lot of just transition literature that gives best practice recommendations, but some of these are not realistic in certain institutional contexts. For example, many of these recommendations draw on the excellent research on coal transitions that has been done on Germany. But Germany is a classic example of a negotiated democracy. It has a proportional electoral system and corporatist structures for organising interest groups' engagement with government. And both of these kinds of institutions facilitate longer-term political compromises among government, industry and unions over key areas of reform like climate policy. But Australia is a competitive democracy. It has a majoritarian electoral system, which incentivises short-termism and results in two-party dominance that begets polarisation. And it lacks those corporatist institutions to facilitate dialogue and compromise among interest groups. And this compromises both the political and the substantive, both the procedural and the substantive pillars of just transition. The upshot of that, and this is really my second lesson, is that especially but not only in jurisdictions with institutions like Australia's, if just transition policy is to get off the ground, sometimes proponents need to take advantage of ad hoc windows of opportunities that arise, particularly when these are driven by non-climate and non-government forces. And the 2 Australian cases that I've been involved in attest to this. The first case is the closure of the Hazelwood Brown coal-fired power station and associated coal mine in the Latrobe Valley region of the state of Victoria. The Hazelwood plant was very old and highly polluting and had for many years been a site and symbol of political contestation. Various attempts by federal and state Labor governments to introduce climate policies and carbon pricing between 2007 and 2013 provoked a political backlash in the Latrobe Valley, and the Hazelwood plant survived that era. So it came as something of a surprise then that in late 2016, the owner of the Hazelwood plant, the French multinational Engie, unilaterally announced its plan to close the plant 5 months later, rather than making further investments in plant upgrades and repairs that would have been needed to comply with the state's health and safety standards. As soon as the closure was announced, then the state Labor government came in with a huge package of transition measures worth equivalent of around €140 million, including a worker transfer scheme, an early retirement scheme, as well as investment in housing and transport infrastructure in the community, and the establishment of a new regional authority to manage the wider energy transition in the valley. So the point is that where the transition had proven politically impossible in the region when government climate policy was seen as the driver, the state government was able to use an externally driven closure as the basis to institute fairly wide-ranging just transition policies and structures. And the presence of these new structures could make it somewhat easier to close the remaining 3 coal-fired power stations in the Latrobe Valley, possibly even if driven by government climate policy. Although, as many of you will know, that is still lacking at federal and state level in Australia in a comprehensive sense. The second case, and more briefly, is the case of Western Australia. There, the state government is undertaking a just transition process for phasing out the state's 3 main coal-fired power stations and associated coal mines, which are concentrated in a small regional town called Collie, south of Perth. Though undoubtedly a contentious process, the government has been able to secure broad stakeholder support for its plans to phase out these operations. And a critical factor here was that renewable energy capacity in the state was and is rapidly expanding due to falling costs, making the existing coal generation increasingly unnecessary and uneconomic. And this economic context lent a certain inevitability to the phase out. And so the process is not so much about whether to phase out, but about exactly when and how it would be done. providing the government with the political space to construct a just transition strategy for the region. My third lesson will be very straightforward, and I think will echo really a lot of the things that Robert's already mentioned, which is really just to emphasise that there's no silver bullet and that the successful just transition requires a coherent vision as well as an inclusive and deliberative process and a comprehensive package of transitional assistance policy measures targeted at both the workers immediately affected as well as the wider communities. And so I'll close there and just note that if you'd like to read more about transitional assistance policies in general or about the Hazelwood case in particular, I have a paper on each of these which I'll share in the chat function shortly. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Fergus. Those are two really interesting examples, and I'm sure our rapporteur, Sinead Mercer, will put the links there for those in her summary report too. Charlotte, you're part of a really innovative initiative in Scotland and a member of the Just Transition Commission there. Could you tell us more about it, please?
Yes, I can. Thank you. I'll begin with a little bit of local context to our situation in Scotland. Since 1990, our emissions have fallen by nearly 47%, which is largely driven by an increase in renewable energy generation and the closure of our coal power generation. And that places us at quite a critical point because we've already picked the low-hanging fruit. And what remains in order for Scotland to reach net zero will be much more visible in the day-to-day impact on people's lives. So we're quite an interesting position and a really interesting time to be part of this commission. Although the Just Transition principle centred around employment and skills, we decided to include the consumers and communities into our thinking and to really broaden the conversation beyond the energy sector, which at the time of our inception was the focus of several Just Transition initiatives elsewhere globally. And the Commission was founded at the start of 2019, so we've been on the go for nearly 2 years now. We also recognised that Scotland's starting position for a transition, although we had already picked much of the low-hanging fruit, already had several injustices in our labour market, in our housing market, and generally with a level of poverty, and that a commitment to delivering a just transition in Scotland needs to really address our existing injustices as well as the potential ones that could arise from this transition to net zero in Scotland. The Scottish Commission is a multidisciplinary group of 12 people. And we knew from day one that we as 12 people could not fully understand, let alone fully address the scale of the challenge unless we took a lot of other people along with us. As a result, each commission meeting that we have held has had a corresponding engagement event with us, with it. And our next one is tomorrow with young people in Scotland. In February of this year, we published our interim report and alongside that, a call for evidence. The economic landscape in Scotland has changed quite a lot since February of this year, and we were subsequently tasked by the Cabinet Secretaries and Scottish Government into whom we report to apply a just transition lens to the concept of a green recovery from the pandemic. The publication of which was made in July. We made 3 overarching learnings so far in our work. The first of which was to plan ahead for all sectors and create very clear transition plans per sector, and that these need to be jointly owned by the Scottish Government and by each relevant sector. What we found that is in Scotland and in the UK, there are a number of membership and trade bodies for the different sectors. And a lot of these are already going some way to create their own pathway to net zero. And these need to be coupled with Scottish Government ambitions and plans and really be jointly owned and jointly deployed. And our second key learning was the role of engagement in a really ongoing and broad way that brings people from communities as well as sectors. We saw that only this way could we generate the real buy-in for the scale of change required to deliver our ambitions. Because of the existing level of injustice in Scotland, in certain communities, just transition isn't on the agenda in their lives and in their communities. And how do we really engage with them going forward and make that a really long-term ongoing process? In Scotland, we have the climate change plan, for which a small amendment was made this year, and the major next republication of the next climate change plan comes in 2024. And that is a really good tool that acts as an ongoing platform in the existing one and the subsequent future one to provide that baseline tool for conducting a lot of this engagement that needs to take place. And our third key learning was building equity into the heart of all policy making, such that the benefits of climate action are shared and the costs do not unfairly burden those who are least likely to pay, and likewise those whose livelihoods are directly impacted as the economy is changing. Following on from that, we provided recommendations for a green recovery, and these built on the three pillars that I have just mentioned, but they leaned most heavily on equity, focusing on how the action set Scotland on a pathway to net zero, including a recommendation that all funding commitments for green recovery had conditionality attached to them on how they set Scotland on a pathway to net zero in a just and fair way. And also how they ensured equity with respect to climate change action, as well as the economic recovery when the immediate pandemic emergency has subsided. So I'll kind of finish there. Likewise with Robert and Fergus, our experience unfolding is that there is quite a complex picture of measures and engagement that is unfolding here and what is required to really bring it forward. But we're looking forward to revisiting some of the sectors which we looked at previously, the kind of landscape in which we are operating and providing recommendations to Scottish Government is very different to what it was a year ago when we were tasked with the challenge. And there are certain sectors, the oil and gas sector in the UK, where the transition is unfolding more rapidly than when we first visited them for collecting evidence. So I'm looking forward to participating in the Q&A, and I will finish my presentation there.
Thanks, Charlotte. I just love that your Just Transition Commission includes an engagement event with every meeting. I think we should steal that idea. It's fabulous. I'm gonna start with the same question to both Robert and Fergus, because you both gave us lessons that could be learned from your experiences. But I'd like to ask you both, starting with Robert, what are things we should avoid doing?
I think it comes back to that point around recognizing that all regions and localities are different. And I'd be concerned that we try and apply standardized methodologies of transition to different regions and different communities. As I said, the regions we are working with are very varied. Some are rural, some are urban, some are quite mono-industrial in character. Others have a more diversified industrial base. And so I think it is that need for a degree of analytical empathy when you're dealing with a community, whether that be a local community or a regional community, analytical empathy. I think it's also about recognizing where power lies, as I said, and working with the reality on the ground. I was quite struck by Sharon's quote, "You can't impose social dialogue." No, you can't impose social dialogue. That's very true, but you have to encourage it. And I think that's something that we are learning through START, how you manage that relationship between those who control agency within the process of transition. But certainly my key point would be the need for that analytical empathy, understanding the unique situation in each community, whether that be a locality or region.
Thanks, Robert. Fergus, any particular things you think we should avoid?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with all of that, and I would add one thing I think it's important to avoid is that there's often a understandable and completely necessary approach on the economic aspects of the response, be that addressing social protection for workers or be that investing in new industries in an affected region. And that's, of course, completely necessary. But there's often an ignorance or unwillingness, inability to address the very real cultural and social aspects of a transition. And often we're dealing here with regions that have a particular legacy that might be a particular identity that might be tied to a legacy industry or kind of particular economic culture. There are obviously going to be social relationships bound up with particular ways of working in that industry, and routines and traditions and so on. And so often dealing with that aspect of change is a very significant part of a transition process that tends to get ignored. And I think just an important way of responding to that is that if you have a government agency or team that's committed to doing a just transition, then you need to have staff that are qualified in that kind of area, be it social psychology or anthropology, and who are skilled in managing the cultural aspects of change, and because they will often be very, very different. As Robert said, that those cultural aspects will often probably be perhaps more variant than some of the economic kinds of responses, though of course they vary too.
Thanks, Fergus. I'm sure, Charlotte, you could probably add on to what Fergus was saying there, and just a question coming in from the chat, which I think is quite relevant to what all of you are saying. Maybe, Charlotte, you could start. Could you suggest an effective way of bringing in democratic social dialogue as part of a just transition?
Ooh, good question. I mean, I think introducing social dialogue is it's critical. I think it's actually easier in an environment where we can meet, which is, of course, at this particular time, there are limitations on which technology people have access to, and certain kind of marginalized groups in society who don't have any access to technology and into online forums. I think that is where really the role of engaging at a higher level into the kind of community forums and other, whether that be sector bodies, trade bodies, local community councils, almost at gateway organizations into larger larger sectors of the community which can't be reached, is a really essential part to establishing that. Yeah.
Thanks. This one comes in from the chat, and it's first of all thanking all of you for your contributions, but saying that they found Dr. Green's discussion of the examples in Australia particularly interesting, and wondering, maybe we'll start with Robert, and then Charlotte, maybe you could answer this too. If you have specific examples, maybe things that aren't related to climate concerns of communities, so non-climate concerns around the just transition that you've experienced.
Well, I think it's recognising the asymmetrical impact of decarbonisation on different communities. So, obviously there are real concerns, across Europe about the preservation of economically valuable employment, such as coal mining. And that's a huge issue, obviously, in Poland, which is highly unionised. But in terms of just looking at something, a very specific example of engagement and mobilisation of a community, I would actually like to bring it quite close to home to Dublin. And as I said, we've been working in the Midlands region in Ireland, looking at the question of peat phase out, which is occurring at a more rapid rate than had been anticipated. And it comes back to also, how do you engage at this time of COVID-19, which Charlie was referencing? And one of the things we had planned a significant process of engagement through workshops in February and March and April in the Midlands. And that was to understand people's ambitions for their communities. trying to understand the process of transition, but not just along the lines of energy transition, but also rural transition. And unfortunately, because of COVID-19, we were unable to undertake those workshops. However, almost every cloud has a silver lining, and we actually had a very inclusive online process of engagement. And through a set of materials that was distributed far and wide through the region to community groups and third sector bodies, etc., we actually provided materials about how transition has to be seen in a wider lens or a broader lens of rural development, and recognizing that there's many drivers of change within rural communities, not only the phase out of peat, but also the digitalization of the economy, different consumer habits, the rise of quality food and organic farming. And I think that's one of the lessons for me, and it's a very specific and tangible lesson, is that you can engage widely during a time of COVID, but to actually have meaningful dialogue, you sometimes have to widen the debate to a wider vision of the affected community. And if you just keep talking about decarbonisation, you begin to narrow the discussion and also the opportunities for delivering that vision. And I think it comes back to that whole thing, systems thinking and systems design. Systems design sounds very lofty, and you think of, ministries and capitals designing systems for the economy. Actually, systems design can be at the level of a street, it can be at the level of a village, and I would say that's a very tangible example from Ireland.
Really good point about going online and the kind of open access format that can bring with including people. Charlotte, maybe you have some specific examples. You mentioned the oil and gas sector in Scotland, and there are whole communities that are built around that. So could you give us some specifics on that?
Yeah, we've got kind of three comments to make. Firstly, the oil and gas industry, and kind of bundle my second example in as well with Scotland's economy. Kind of regionally, in the northeast of Scotland, is largely focused on the oil and gas industry, very dominant industry in that area. And in the central belt of Scotland is where the bulk of our industrial activity lies. So a lot of our manufacturing and chemical sciences, chemical industries. And with both of those groups, we find quite a delicate balance between its, building on what Fergus said about the kind of legacy industry and the local culture of the industry that is there. And, the priorities on, particularly with those in those areas, particularly in our industrial area in the Central Belt, is that the focus is much more on employment than on tackling climate. And that's, something that we're really, and ultimately many of the businesses which are operating in that area, in that field, are multinational businesses. And if it becomes, when we engage with them, they're saying if the business environment to operate here is no longer attractive, we'll shut and we'll do business elsewhere. And that brings a whole host of other, your question was about non-climate concerns, but, we can very easily reduce our emissions in Scotland by just switching everything off. But then, we've got this huge offshoring emissions problem that comes alongside that. And I think that's something that's a really key missing point in the discussion about just transition, particularly in Scotland, is about tackling the climate crisis, climate emergency in Scotland, but also the kind of economic sensitive balance about that, where, the priority for those, likewise, we in the Northeast where I live, there are a lot of offshore workers who, they just don't think that climate is going to affect their employment in their career. So kind of why bother being engaged in the subject? And that is also a very challenging balance as well, where hydrocarbons, many believe will still be part of our net zero economy, but their role will be very different, and the way that the CO2 is managed will be very different. And the third comment that I wanted to make on non-climate concerns of just transition is I represent on the Commission a youth charity called 2050 Climate Group, and we undertook a large piece of engagement with youth in Scotland. And one of the key findings from the research that we did was that a just transition should encompass, there's a huge opportunity to create a more inclusive, healthier, happier society, and build in well-being economy principles into a just transition. And, you know, there are a lot of, I guess, like the more kind of softer lifestyle-based aspects that could be and opportunities that could be built into a transition, which have nothing to do with climate, but a lot more to do with the well-being of society.
Charlotte, that's great examples. We've lost Fergus, unfortunately, because I was going to field the next question to him. But Robert, you have lots of experience in Ireland, and this question from the chat you might be able to answer. Do we have the skills base in Ireland to facilitate the prolonged and complex conversations that will be needed to deliver real just transition?
I think that's a question that can be applied to every member state of the European Union. Do we have the skill sets, the capabilities, the capacities, the methods for complex multi-actor engagement and dialogue? And the answer is no. I think we are learning quickly. I think there are good examples. Like I'm very impressed. I've worked with a range of actors, and I'm very impressed by, you know, the work not only of government and the private sector, but I'm also seeing NGOs playing an incredibly valuable role in the process of transition. So, for example, in the Jiu Valley in Romania, a traditional coal mining community, Greenpeace, Bank Watch, etc., are really driving the multi-actor dialogue. And so different actors are stepping up to the plate to drive forward that dialogue. And it varies across countries and regions who are these catalysts for change. But to come back to that question, do we have the skills, the capacities at the moment, and the methods for really accelerating and optimizing this dialogue? I think the answer is no. And it comes back to that whole question, sorry to bang the drum again, about thinking in a systems fashion. We're just not very good at it. And it starts right at the heart of government, where you have ministries and departments of government who think in a completely siloed fashion. And I think we have to find new ways of coordinating society for transition. And that is a very complex topic, but until we deal with those complex topics, we're not going to optimize the rate of transition.
You answered my follow-up question. I was going to ask you, what skill do we need? But it sounds like getting out of silo thinking would be the number one skill.
Definitely.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Charlotte, one question for you. What do you think the state could do to support a just transition? Robert mentioned the role of NGOs and civil society, and you have lots of experience with that. But is there specific actions that the state could be taking now to support this?
I think the biggest thing that state could do is exactly what Robert said, and is to, you know, smash apart the silos and think in a much more cross-cutting way. The key recommendations which we have found in Scotland, they have, you know, there are a few recommendations that we make which are, you know, quite specific. You know, there's item on focusing on transport, you know, fuel efficiency, warmer homes and things. But, you know, ultimately they all come down to how is state funding given to projects and initiatives? How is policy planned? How are, you know, and it's things which are far more cross-cutting than like, how is a transport bill created? How is an energy bill created? How is an agriculture bill created? It's, you know, much, much more cross-cutting, much more woven together. I think, you know, it may be quite extreme, maybe not, to suggest that, you know, government needs to reorganise to address that, or at least have, you know, a much better representation in different departments. But it's definitely something which is missing. That's the biggest activity that state can take, is to actually look internally at how they are deploying the measures which they are taking in order to reach their own ambitions.
Yeah, I mean, we set up our governments by nature into silos. We have our Minister for Transport and our Minister for Agriculture, so it's very hard to dismantle that. Do you feel that the Just Transition Commission that you're part of helps to kind of make it a cross-cutting issue, or is that part of the solution?
A bit of both. So the Scottish Just Transition Commission feeds into 3 cabinet secretaries, so into 3 different areas of government. We're focused mostly into energy and climate change. Perhaps most naturally, that's the cabinet secretary that we specifically liaise with regularly, but we do report into 3. It's the key recommendation that we give every time we speak to them. Is to not approach and not look in silos. But I think perhaps the challenge would be that we would then be asked with how they should be organised, which is a much, much bigger question. But yeah, it's the cross-cutting, and I think they understand. I think one of the things which has come out, you know, it's been well demonstrated with certainly what I've seen locally in the UK with how COVID has been managed, is that you know, the health secretary introduces one measure, and then, you know, transport and hospitality are suddenly, you know, a bit kind of shocked into what's happening, and, you know, we're really seeing that siloed approach on a very different issue. But, you know, the silos are, I think you can really see the cracks.
Thanks, that's a great analogy and a perfect ending, because unfortunately we are out of time for this session, but I want to thank you both, Charlotte and Robert, for your time, and of course Fergus in absentia wherever he may be, and we hope to see you in the breakout sessions tomorrow, and enjoyed your participation and your expertise. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you to the audience for all of your questions and your participation today. I hope you all agree it's been an excellent afternoon with lots of experts. And thanks to the EEAC network for hosting, for organizing this conference, and for NESC for hosting it here in Dublin. Larry, we are back tomorrow. What can we expect?
Thanks, Cara. Yeah, and just before I say what we expect, I thought it was really interesting today. In one sense, we got a very positive and upbeat framing of the challenge that we face, and we heard about opportunity to use very large funding streams to support the just transition. But I also, I think, heard that it won't be easy. We heard about contested solutions and winners and losers, and really trying to pinpoint exactly the most vulnerable in particular transitions. But I think the thing that came out and that really teases up well for yesterday is that in order to make this transition actually work, you have to get into the detail. And we heard from the last panel words like we have to co-create. I love the idea that we have to work with analytical empathy with people that we work with in a policy sense. And I really think the message that came through from the National Youth Council, you know, this plea that we have to help them save their communities. I think we have to take that responsibility very seriously. So what came across to me is, from day one, is that we need to get into more of the detail. So thankfully, tomorrow, in a number of parallel sessions, that's what we'll do. So we'll get into the detail on sessions about employment vulnerability. We'll get into detail about the water, just transition around water. So we'll have 3 parallel sessions at 9 a.m. and they will get into those types of issues. And then we'll have a short break and we'll get into 3 other sessions at 11 o'clock where we look at things like the state and the citizen, we look at finance, and we look at how advice is given to the policy system around just transition. So I really look forward to that tomorrow, and I look forward to seeing you again then on Thursday when, as we've said, we're delighted that we'll have the President of our country, Michael D. Higgins, will address us with a keynote speech.
Thanks, Larry. I'm looking forward to that too. To end the day, we have a special musical piece to share with you. Sonic Pollinators, composed by Karen Power and performed by both Karen and the Quiet Music Ensemble. This piece demonstrates how collaborative artistic process invests in our community to support healthy, informed, and a generous society. These explorations encourage empowerment and expression. So let's support these conversations, critical thinking, and the benefits that arts and culture play in supporting opportunities for inclusion, social connections, equity, and spatial identity. Now more than ever, I think it's clear that sustainable communities need cultural engagement and critical and artistic thinking. Special thanks to Karen Power, Quiet Music Ensemble, Offaly County Council, and Julie Spallin, who all provided the video and beautiful imagery that accompanies this performance. Enjoy, and we look forward to seeing you in the morning.
I think of my field recordings really as kind of creative snapshots, which then become source material for different compositions. These snapshots carry with them unique experiences in how they've been made. In this case, my memory of how it felt to be in the middle of a natural meadow, alone, sun streaming on my face, waiting, being simultaneously part of and outside of the natural act of pollination. Sonic Pollinators project essentially allowed me time to explore County Offaly and its many beautiful locations. For the final performance of Sonic Pollinators, each member of the Quiet Music Ensemble is given what I've called an individual aural part. During the performance, they hear this part through one ear, and the other ear they're listening to each other and the aural score, which is the tape part, which the audience also hears. The idea being that there's always some element of listening going on in the space. Fundamentally, I believe that by creating this kind of active listening environment, it puts us all, so that's composer, performer, audience, on the same level, and invites us all to sort of communally listen, if you like. And this, for me, seems to create a very special environment.
Absolutely astounding and most imaginative, and made your own imagination stimulated, and you could see everything. Well, I could see all sorts of beasties rubbing their legs together and the rings going up and down and things zooming backwards and forwards.
And great resonance there with the cello, and lovely to hear of the bees making music.
And yet stillness as well, and most imaginative and delighted.